Hi everyone, it's me, Jess. I really did have to weed out sounds so negative. I'm going to be spending the next half an hour or possibly more gushing about some of the best books that I read this year. So strap in. Hi everyone, it's me, Jess, with the long-awaited best books of the year video. I'm going to be talking through these books in chronological order from the beginning of my reading year to the end of my reading year. Because I've already made videos where I talk extensively about these books, I will try to keep my comments brief, but still try to give you an idea of what it was that I loved so much about these books. I think I have 12 fiction books, and then I have 3 classics, a memoir, and another nonfiction book. So I've given myself a bit of liberty when it comes to the number of books. I did have to make some very tough decisions to come up with this list, and I'm still going back and forth on some of my choices in my mind. So, I mean, this is just the way these things go. Okay, so let's kick things off. The first book on my list is Briefly a Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. I read this as a buddy read with Lori. In fact, quite a few of my favorite books are books that I buddy read with other people or were books that I hosted read-alongs for. Even though reading these books with other people probably enhanced my reading experience, I've had just as many reading experiences with others where we all hated the book. It doesn't really influence my feelings about the book, but that's an aside. Briefly, A Delicious Life tells the story of Chopin and his love, George Sand, through the eyes of a ghost, a young girl named Blanca, who died 400 years before the story is told. Chopin and George Sand, an author in her own right, which I learned about after reading this book, are on vacation in Mallorca because of Chopin's ailing health. It's there that our story begins. So Blanca has been actually hanging around this monastery in Mallorca since the time of her death when she was a young woman. And she discovers that she loves women, and she becomes completely enamored of George Sand. In the course of seeing George Sand through Blanca's eyes, I couldn't help but fall in love with George myself. George Sand is a real person. She was a French author, and her character is so well portrayed in this story. Daring, eccentric, exciting, and so tough. The other really enthralling thing about this book is that Blanca is able to move through time, and she is also able to narrate from the perspective of the inner world of the main characters, which could seem hokey or could be quite poorly executed, but Nell Stevens managed to do this with such a skilled and artistic hand. The writing is fantastic, and I found that this was something unique and different and such a creative way of telling what was ultimately historical fiction, but through the eyes of a ghost. There are lots of other themes that are explored in the story, including how Chopin and George Sand are not welcomed by the locals, issues around feminism and queer identity. I highly recommend this one. It was definitely one of my favorite reads of this year. I think I'm going to be saying that after all of them. But I absolutely loved this one. Northwoods by Daniel Mason. I read this early on in the year, and I still can't stop thinking about what a pleasant reading experience this was. I read it as part of Eric Carl Anderson's book club through his Patreon. And actually, I haven't had a chance to read anything else through his Patreon, but I'm so glad that I read Northwoods. It's a wonderful story that has as its protagonist this house, what is now New England. The story opens in the 1760s and spans 400 years following the lives of the residents of this house. It can be read as a series of separate vignettes, but I really experienced the novel as a complete novel, a complete work of fiction with different styles of writing for different sections of the book that were appropriate for their time as we moved through time. And it gave me, as a reader, this very strong sense of place. Characters that inhabited this house and the stories of the lives that they led were at times heartbreaking, at times hilarious, and at times very, very odd. The house itself goes through periods of growth and renovation and expansion, and it also goes through periods of neglect and decay. I don't know if I mentioned, but this story, as well as my first favorite of the year, also involves ghosts. So maybe there's a bit of a theme happening there. There's even a ghost hunter in this one. But what I liked most about Northwoods is that it addressed so many topics of human society and existence. Everything from community versus individualism, mental health issues, the connection between human beings and nature, and above all else, the brutality of the passage of time. There's just so much to offer in the pages between the covers of this one. Loved and Missed by Susie Boyd. I had to read this for the BookTube prize. It was in the first round that I judged for my first year judging, and this book made me so sad. I was weeping, weeping at this book. Ultimately, the story is about grief and loss and the complexity of mother-daughter relationships. In terms of the plot, we have the story of Ruth, the protagonist, who is a woman in her maybe 60s, and her daughter, Eleanor, is a drug addict. And at the opening of the story, her daughter has just had a baby named Lily, and Ruth comes to care for Lily because her daughter can't. It's brutal. The way that Susie Boyd has written this story also very much presents a relationship where so much is unsaid and so much is unresolved. I think that might have been what struck a chord with me. I found that so unusual, and I think it's a quality of relationships that's quite difficult to communicate in a novel, and Susie Boyd has done this extremely well in terms of the relationship between Eleanor and Ruth. And so ultimately, I also felt that this novel was about love and acceptance. Through Ruth's relationship with Lily, she is able to gain more acceptance of the reality of her daughter's situation, and she's able to experience a different kind of love than what she had with her daughter. It's a very good book. I'm surprised more people have not spoken about it, and for me it was just it ripped my, I think I said in my original review, it just ripped my heart out of my chest and squeezed it and shredded it and then put it back. So I feel a bit changed after having read this one. And I think what I love most about it is how messy it is and how real it feels in terms of the characters and their relationship and their hardships. And Then She Fell by Alicia Elliott. This is on my list because I think that although the novel does have some flaws, it gets a little bit confusing near the end, or I found it to be a little bit confusing near the end. I think this is a fantastic debut novel that is handling themes that I feel are very important. Themes of cultural appropriation, family dynamics, mental illness, and trauma. Our main character is Alice, and she is a new mother. She's just had a baby girl. Her husband, Steve, is an academic. He's even going so far as to study Mohawk, which is Alice's own native language. As you can see, there's already quite a bit of commentary happening here. Dawn is a healthy baby, and it would seem that Alice has everything she could ever want. But living this lifestyle as an Indigenous woman with the history of her family back on the reservation, she is experiencing a lot of cognitive dissonance, having moved from the reservation to this very white, affluent neighborhood. And she's experiencing the grief, the recent death of her own mother. So it really grapples with so much intergenerational trauma, and also the trauma of experiencing racism in microaggressions or even in more overt situations, and mental illness, including a kind of psychosis that Alice experiences that might or might not be related to postpartum or something like it. I'm trying to be brief, but there is just so much packed into this story. I was really blown away by it when I read it. I think it's a fantastic debut, and I will be very excited to see what comes next from Alicia Elliott. Brotherless Night by V.V. Ganeshanathan. Oh, I love this book so much. This was wonderful, this book. I think it deserved to win both the Carol Shields Prize and the Women's Prize. And I don't know how I could not include it on my list of top 10 books of the year. I absolutely fell in love with Sashi, our 16-year-old protagonist, or at least she's 16-year-old, or at least she's 16 years old when we meet her. Actually, I think she's older when we meet her, and then we go back in time. It begins in 1981 at the beginning of what would become a vicious civil war in Sri Lanka. However, Sashi's dream is to become a doctor, and we begin the story with her experiences at school with her brothers and her brothers' friends. In particular, one friend, this friend of hers who goes by Kay, becomes a, quote, terrorist. And we know that from the beginning of the story because at the outset she writes, "I met the first terrorist I knew when he was deciding to become one." Then we go from there into the plot of the war itself, how Sashi survives, what happens with to her brothers during the war, what happens to her friend Kay and the rest of their families over the course of this civil war. Ultimately, Sashi becomes the symbol for the conflict between the two sides in the war. Because she has studied to become a doctor, she regularly finds herself in situations where she is caring for people who have been hurt from both sides of the fighting. And in particular, her own brother and Kay are heavily involved with the Tamil Tigers. In addition, Sashi is trying to maintain some kind of stability for her family and is trying as best she can to remain non-political in this circumstance. Sashi is a fantastic character, and she comes of age over the course of this story. It's a gripping novel. It's so well written. The topic is one that I didn't know anything about before going into it, and I just loved this book so much. James by Percival Everett. I honestly don't know how this isn't on people's best books of the year list, but who am I to say? Everybody has their different reasons for appreciating a book. A boyfriend I had once said, "There's no accounting for taste." This is a phenomenal book. Of course, it won the National Book Award this year. It's not the only book by Percival Everett that I have read. I've also read The Trees, which I very much enjoyed, and I hope to read more of his books in the future. James is a book that I feel everybody already knows about, and I reviewed it extensively already. But what I will say about this book is that the writing is deceptively simple. This is not a complicated story, and the words chosen are chosen extremely carefully. And the images and situations that the characters find themselves in are so deliberate and so well crafted to communicate the experience of Jim, our enslaved character, and characters like him, that it absolutely blew my mind. Not only is it a literary masterpiece in terms of the feat of the writing, but it communicates this experience so effectively in a way that makes you feel that you have learned something important by having read the novel. And that was the feeling that I had. In particular, the feeling that slaves had at the time of being completely trapped and having no idea who they could trust, when they could trust them, what to say, how to say it, what to do, when to do it, whether to run, whether to stay. All of that experience is encapsulated here, along with the fundamental terror of living as a slave. And so I just think that it's hard to ignore how incredible this novel is, or at least it's hard for me to ignore. So of course it had to be on my top 10 list. And that really just feels like the tip of the iceberg of what I experienced from reading this book. So you can always go and check out my longer review of James if you're curious about some of the other things that I got out of reading it. Housekeeping by Marilynne Robinson. I talked about this in the college reading vlog. I also talked about it in a wrap-up. I'll try to be brief here. I loved this book. The story is about two sisters, Ruthie and Lucille, who have been essentially abandoned by their mother. She actually commits suicide. It takes place in the fictional town of Fingerbone, which is a town that has a lake. The lake plays an important role in the story. Initially, the girls are taken in by their maternal grandmother, but their grandmother becomes unable to care for them, and their Aunt Sylvia comes from away to take care of them. And their Aunt Sylvia is a very odd, eccentric character who is what we would call today a bit of a nomad. She is definitively uninterested in societal norms and is very unconventional. She is not interested in keeping house, and hence the title of the book. Both girls respond to Sylvie in completely different ways. Ruthie adores her, Lucille abhors her. Well, maybe that's a strong word, but they both respond completely differently to Sylvie's care. And in many ways, Sylvie's presence, although meant to be that of a guardian, offers the girls quite a lot of freedom. And so they have to figure out ultimately how to survive in the world on their own. And the two girls go in very different directions in terms of their behavior and their conformity to societal expectations. The past and memory is a very big theme in this book. In some parts of the writing, it feels almost as if you're in a dream or you're in an alternate reality. It has this atmospheric quality to it. I would say it's a quietly haunting novel about family, loss, identity, especially for women, and the search for a sense of belonging in the world. I've talked about it extensively, so again, I'm going to leave it there. But it is one of my best reads of the year. One of the wonderful things that happened for me this year is that not only did I discover a book that's on my best of list, I discovered an author who I am not sure can do anything wrong when it comes to writing. I've read 2 of her books already this year, and I'm currently reading another as part of a group, and that would be Claudia Pinheiro. I I don't know how I'm choosing which of these two goes on my best of the year. These two books could not be any more different from one another, but what they have in common is the writing of one of the best writers I have ever read. Initially billed as a crime writer, Claudia Pinheiro actually writes about very interesting and important issues, especially to do with women in society, but also just having to do with the human condition. A Little Luck, for example, is about a woman who has regrets and about how she lives her life with a very heavy history. I don't want to say anything to give it away. Elena Knows is a completely different story and has to do with a woman who is experiencing Parkinson's and the daughter who cares for her. So it explores the experience of the caregiver as well as the experience of the sufferer herself. If I was forced, I think I would probably pick Elena Knows, only because the topic was so relatable to me, and it's the first time that I've seen this presented in this way in a novel. I thought it was spectacular. It does involve a mystery because Rita is mysteriously found hanging from the bell tower in the church. And then we follow Elena as she tries to get answers as to why this happened. But Elena's life is painstaking in terms of her experience. And the entire book is divided by the pill that she has to take over the course of the day. So for example, the first section is pill number 1, the second section is pill number 2. Despite her disease, Elena is a very strong-willed character, and she finds her way to the answers that she seeks. And throughout the story, as we follow her in her pursuit of the truth, we are with her in believing what she believes, and we are with her when she is forced to confront her beliefs. So, I mean, I just think the writing is fantastic, and it's deceptive to think that Claudia Pinheiro is writing about crime, which is what I thought when I first started talking about this book. It is absolutely brilliant. I can't say anything more about it. I know that this was on a lot of people's best lists of last year, and I know that I'm late to the party, but I am at the party. I am here, I am present, and I am 1000% blown away by Claudia Pinheiro. So I'm just so happy to have found her work. And I'm just loving being part of this group that is reading her works that have been translated. The Empusium by Olga Tokarczuk. I don't think this is going to be on all that many people's best of lists, partly because it's just come out and I don't know how many people have read it. Also because I think there are a lot of people who are not going to appreciate this book in the same way that I did. I recently spoke about it in a reading vlog at length, so I don't want to spend too much time on it here. This is the story of a young man who goes to what is a health resort in the mountains and stays at a nearby guest house where mysterious things begin to happen. By the second chapter, we have a dead body, and from there we have an unfolding of why people are dying. We never get an answer necessarily to all of the mysterious deaths, and Olga Tokarczuk is using this as an opportunity to have her characters sit around at dinner and discuss all kinds of topics, from politics to the war, which is imminent. This is at the beginning of, set at the beginning of the First World War. But mostly the men sit around and they discuss women and how inferior women are to men. At some points, it's absurd, in fact, the things that the men have to say about women. At the end of the novel, Tokarczuk reveals to us that most of the ideas that are presented in these conversations are actually taken from extensive research that she has done, and they're ideas that have been espoused by popular thinkers, philosophers, writers, people like William Shakespeare, William S. Burroughs, Sigmund Freud, of course, Jack Kerouac, D.H. Lawrence. The list goes on and on. And so as much as it's a story of people thinking these ridiculous things about women at the turn of the century, they're even espoused by thinkers from more recent times. And I think that ultimately what Tokarczuk is saying in the package of a pretty fun, mystery, magical story about men dying in November is that men do not have groundbreaking thoughts, and that these men are not as genius as we decide that they are. And that ultimately we decide our own reality in terms of what we experience and what we think and what we purport to be fact. So I'm going to leave it at there because as I said, I did speak extensively about it, but I think that this woman is an incredible author, and I am so glad that I read this because I think it's a fantastic book, maybe even better than Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead, although I'll have to reread that one to be able to make a proper comparison. Fall on Your Knees by Anne Marie MacDonald. This is a family saga, if ever you wanted to read a family saga. It follows the Piper sisters from before the First World War and into the early 20th century. Also set in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, so we get the backdrop of life in small town Nova Scotia, particularly New Waterford, where the family lives, and also bits of Sydney, which is the bigger town in Cape Breton. But most of the work is that of miners, and their father, James, becomes a bootlegger. He worked in the mines, he went to the war, he becomes a bootlegger, and he has a very dark side to him. And ultimately, it's about the relationship that he has with his daughters, and it goes to some very dark places. This book just, I don't know, it just has a very special place in my heart. Anne Marie MacDonald's writing is very special, I think. I found her writing can be very poetic, it can be lyrical, and it can also be very devastating. At times, it's very funny. She does an incredible job of creating atmosphere. I could smell the ocean while I was reading this book. Some people might find the pacing of this story to be a little bit slow. In Anne Marie MacDonald's typical style, she is building up for the tragic unfolding of the story of this family's saga. And it is a saga. Characters' emotions are very deeply felt on the page, and she does this wonderful job of portraying the weight of their struggles. It's a great book. You should read it. I love this one. I think I liked it even better the second time reading it than I did the first. I think I only gave it 4 stars. I can't find my listing on Goodreads, but I think I only gave it 4 stars when I read it the first time. So those are my 10 fiction books, but the video is not over yet. I also have 3 classics that I wanted to make a brief mention of, one of which I haven't been able to include in a wrap-up yet because I just haven't had the opportunity to do it. So I'll talk a little bit more about that one. The other 2, actually 2 of them I haven't talked about in much detail. The first one though, Invisible Man, I did make an entire video about Invisible Man, and you can go back and watch that video if you want to see a full review of this incredible piece of literature about the experience of a Black man moving from the South to New York City in the late 50s. The topic as the title suggests, is about identity and the concept of invisibility or visibility, or what it means to be a Black man moving through the world, particularly at that time. It's incredible. The hallmark of this novel is its surrealism, and it is an incredible ride. Very, very intense at times, but absolutely worth the time. East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I mean, I look at all the tabs. I read this, I hosted a group read for this book over the summer, and I just loved every minute of reading East of Eden. What can I say? I'm going to have to make a standalone video about my thoughts on East of Eden because I haven't done that yet. It will be forthcoming. It is, again, one of the best books that I think I've ever read. I did say that Middlemarch is the best book ever written, but East of Eden is up there. In case you didn't know the plot of East of Eden, it is the story of two families, the Trasks and the Hamiltons, and a story about two brothers that mirrors the biblical story of Cain and Abel. The characters are incredible. Kathy, who is a villain in the story, is one of the best villains I think I have ever read, ever. I loved this book so much, and I have so many more things that I want to say about it, but I have to leave it for another time. And then finally, a book by an author that was suggested to me by someone in the comments. I'm sorry, I don't know who it was, but I thank you so much. That is Clarice Lispector. The book that I read is her last novel. It's like a novella, it's quite short, and it's called The Hour of the Star. As you can see, I have it all tabbed up, and I would like to talk about it a lot more than I'm going to be able to today, but I will just say that we're following a young woman named Macabea and her author, Rodrigo. So Rodrigo is writing the story of 19-year-old Macabea. We already don't know which character represents Lispector's alter ego. Is it Rodrigo, the author, or is it Macabea, the young, poor girl represented in the pages? The way that the story is written is fascinating because Macabea is more of a 2D character, and she is written as a kind of muse to Rodrigo. Macabea moves from the countryside to Sao Paulo in search of a better life. She's extremely poor. She manages to find a job working as a typist in an office where she is largely overlooked by her peers, and she feels that her life has no worth. So in many ways, this book is very philosophical, it's very existential, and it explores these really deep questions about poverty and invisibility and the absurdity of life through the tragic life of Macabea as told by Rodrigo S.M., our narrator. Lispector here does offer a very deep reflection on the life of a marginalized individual in the character of Macabea. It has interspersed kind of philosophical musings as well as presenting very mundane aspects to Macabea's life. And Rodrigo's presence is felt throughout the story. He regularly inserts himself and addresses the reader directly, basically breaking that fourth wall as he tells Macabea's story. He regularly questions his motives in telling Macabea's story. It's fascinating. And as I said, I have so much more to say about it, but I have to leave it at that because this video is already extremely long. So I have two more books that I just want to mention. The first is a memoir that I read at the beginning of the year. This is the memoir of Masha Maria Aliokina, the Russian activist and member of the punk art all-women's group Pussy Riot. This is written after her escape to the US, and it recounts her experience, especially when she was incarcerated in gulag-like conditions in a prison in Russia. It includes journal entries and drawings. She actually signed it because I saw Pussy Riot last year, and this book was just so incredibly inspiring to me, as is Masha as a person, just everything that she has lived through. And despite the defeats that she has faced and the injustices that she has faced inside and outside of the prison cell, she continues to persuade the reader to speak out, to be active politically. She believes so fiercely in activism and the ability for individuals to perpetuate change by speaking out. It actually just takes my breath away. The amount of courage and the amount of single-mindedness that this individual has in the face of Putin's government and the Orthodox Russian Church. So it's quite amazing. It was so inspiring, and it also made me quite sad because of the innocence that was taken away from these young girls when they were thrown into prison for performing their protest art. Masha is quite literally the girl next door who had the courage to protest the oppression of the patriarchy. She was arrested in 2012 after she and other members of Pussy Riot performed a protest song in a public cathedral. For this, she was sentenced to 2 years in a penal colony, which, by the way, she protested against when she was in this prison. She objected to the gulag conditions and wrote in protest of them and pleaded for better conditions for herself and her fellow inmates. She did this via letter writing from her cell, and ultimately she was able to gain some integrity of the human rights for her and her fellow prisoners. Anyway, I could go on and on about this one as well, but I realized that I must stop there. If you want to go back and see my review, it's from one of my wrap-ups early on in 2024. And then last but not least is the nonfiction book of the year for me, which is Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein takes the concept of her own experience with an online double and begins to explore the idea of the polarizing political views of the left and in particular the alt-right. This is just a phenomenal book. I can't say too much about it today, but again, I spoke about it at length in a past review, so please do check out that review. This was an incredible read, and I'm still thinking about this book now. It just covers so much ground. There is no way that I could speak about all of the insights that I got from reading this one. So there you have it, my best books of 2024. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I just want to give a special thank you to all of my subscribers. This year I reached the milestone of hitting 1,000 subscribers and becoming monetized. And although it's been a big thrill, I actually am most grateful for all of our interactions in the comments, in the read-alongs, in little conversations on the side over Voxer or Instagram. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you so much for being here, and a very happy new year to you. See you in 2025. Bye for now. So strap in, because I'm going to be gushing about all the books that I loved this year. I have my handy dandy notes, and my kettle won't stop beeping. Shush, kettle. So the books that I've chosen are in order of when I read them over the course of the year. Shut up, stop eating. I don't know why the kettle has decided to beep and beep. Come on. Chair. Oh my god, chair, table, the whole thing. It's a mess. I don't even remember where it was. So I'm going to be talking of the book. I'm going to be talking through these books in no particular. I can't say if reading with someone else enhances the experience or if it's the book itself. I think I can safely say though that. But in 1981, Sasha. Do I say Sasha or Sasha?